I spent years believing my heart was mistranslated at birth, that somewhere in the cosmic assembly line, the blueprint got smudged. Instructions written in a dialect no one else seemed to recognize. My chest held weather patterns that confused people, tides that rose at the wrong times, a way of asking for closeness that made others step back, squinting, as if trying to read something written in a language they'd never studied. Most people arrived without learning even the first word. Not because they were cruel, not because they lacked capacity for love, but because they only knew how to love in the dialect they grew up with, the one passed down through generations like an heirloom no one questioned. They offered what they understood. They gave what they were taught. They repeated the rituals that worked on others, expecting the same alchemy to transform me. It never did. And so I learned to shrink myself. I became a translator of my own soul, converting the raw, trembling truth of what I needed into something simpler, something less frightening, something that didn't require anyone to meet me in the dark with a flashlight and the patience to search. I made my needs smaller, folding them into shapes that could fit through narrow doorways. I made my wounds quieter, muffling the sound until even I could barely hear them. I made my longing polite, dressed it up in acceptable language, added please and if it's not too much trouble and I don't want to be a burden. In the silence that followed, a question took root. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe my emotional architecture was too complex, too labyrinthine for anyone to navigate. Maybe the way I felt, this overwhelming, oceanic need for depth, was an inconvenience rather than a truth. Maybe I was built incorrectly, assembled from spare parts that didn't quite fit the standard model of how people were supposed to love and be loved. I carried that question like a stone in my pocket for years. Carl Jung once wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. I underlined that sentence in a book I bought at 23, desperate for someone, even a dead psychologist, to validate what I was experiencing. Because most of my life, I met people who never reached the depth where transformation begins. They stayed at the surface, loving from their surface, listening from their surface, touching from their surface. They skimmed across the top of me like stones skipped across water, creating ripples, sure, but never diving deep enough to discover what lived in the depths. And then they wondered, with genuine confusion, why nothing in me moved, why I remained closed, why their love bounced off me like light off a mirror, reflected back, but never absorbed. I couldn't explain it to them. How do you tell someone that their love, however sincere, doesn't speak to the part of you that's been waiting in the dark? How do you say, without sounding ungrateful or impossible, that kindness isn't the same as understanding, that affection isn't the same as recognition? Jung called this the tragedy of the unlived life, the part of you that remains unopened because no one speaks the language that unlocks it, the chapters of your soul that stay unwritten because no one asks the right questions, the songs that die in your throat because no one knows how to listen for them. My unlived life waited, quietly, in the shadow, untranslated, unmirrored, unmet. It waded through relationships that felt like wearing shoes that almost fit, close enough to walk in, but never comfortable enough to run. It waded through conversations that touched everything except what mattered. It waded through love that felt like standing in front of a locked door, knowing the room beyond held everything I needed, but lacking the key. The years accumulated like dust on unopened books. I dated people who loved me in their own languages. Some spoke through acts of service, arriving with groceries and fixed leaky faucets, showing love through the tangible. Others spoke through words of affirmation, offering compliments like bouquets, believing praise could fill whatever emptiness they sensed in me. A few spoke through physical touch, thinking proximity could substitute for understanding. None of them were wrong. They were just speaking different dialects to a heart that required something else entirely. I needed someone who could read the silence between my sentences as fluently as the words themselves. Someone who understood that my quietness wasn't absence, but presence, a deep listening, a processing, a way of being that required space to breathe. I needed someone who recognized that my intensity wasn't instability, but passion, a refusal to experience life at half volume. But mostly, I needed someone who didn't flinch at my depth. Someone who could stand at the edge of my complexity and think, yes, this is where I want to build my home. Someone who saw my emotional weather patterns, the sudden storms, the unexpected clearings, the fog that rolled in without warning, and instead of running for shelter, simply learned to read the sky. That person felt impossible, mythical, a fantasy I'd invented to make loneliness feel noble. Until one day, without warning, without dramatic music or cinematic lighting, someone arrived who spoke me. Not the version of me the world sees, not the version shaped by survival, polished by years of trying to be easier to love, but the secret me, the deep me, the one who lives beneath the masks I wear to stay safe in a world that rewards simplicity over complexity. It happened gradually, then all at once. A conversation that went past midnight, where I didn't have to perform enthusiasm or hide my melancholy. A moment of silence that felt like understanding rather than awkwardness. A response to something I'd said that revealed they'd been listening not just to my words, but to the tremor beneath them, the unspoken thing I was too afraid to name. Something ancient inside me finally exhaled. Something clenched for years, since childhood, maybe. Since the first time I learned that my way of loving confused people, began to soften. My shoulders, which I didn't realize I'd been holding up around my ears like armor, lowered. My breath, shallow for so long I'd forgotten what full lungs felt like, deepened. The guarded animal inside my chest, the one perpetually ready to flee, lifted its head and stopped running. Because this person didn't just love me. They understood my emotional architecture. They learned the grammar of my heart, studied it the way linguists study dying languages, with reverence and attention. They heard the tremor in my voice that everyone else missed, the slight shift in pitch that signaled I was about to retreat. They sensed the shift in my energy before I spoke, reading the subtle changes in my body language like weather forecasters read approaching storms. They knew when I needed space and when I needed closeness. When my silence meant I'm processing and when it meant I'm hurting. When my laughter was genuine and when it was armor. When my I'm fine meant I was fine and when it meant I was drowning. It was a miracle, really, how everything began to click. like puzzle pieces I'd been trying to force together for years, suddenly revealing they belonged to different puzzles entirely. And this person had been holding the missing pieces all along. Conversations that used to feel like work became effortless. Vulnerability that used to terrify me became natural. Love that used to feel like a performance became recognition. I stopped negotiating my worth, stopped running the calculations in my head. Is this ask too much? Is this feeling too big? Will this need send them running? I stopped apologizing for what I felt, for the depth, the intensity, the complexity. Stopped adding disclaimers to my emotions. I know this is probably silly, but, or I'm being too sensitive, but, or I'm sorry for being difficult. I stopped shrinking to fit the emotional vocabulary of someone else's limits. With them, I was no longer too much, no longer complicated in a way that sounded like a problem to solve, no longer high maintenance or intense or a lot to handle. I was simply understood, seen, met at the exact depth I'd been trying to reach my entire life. Love became less of a performance and more of a recognition, less of a negotiation where I traded parts of myself for acceptance, and more of a resonance, two tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. Two instruments that, when played together, created harmonies neither could achieve alone. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the shadow, the part of us that hides everything too raw, too intense, too sacred for the world, the repository of all the feelings we learned were unacceptable, the vault where we locked away the parts of ourselves that scared people or made them uncomfortable, or simply didn't fit the narrative they wanted to believe about who we were. My shadow held years of unspoken truths. It held the anger I was taught to transform into sadness because sadness was more acceptable in a woman. It held the ambition I learned to minimize because ambition made others feel threatened. It held the neediness I was ashamed of, the jealousy I denied, the darkness I pretended didn't exist. It held every too much I'd ever been called and internalized as truth. When someone speaks your language, your shadow doesn't retreat. It steps forward. It softens. It stops demanding protection because finally, someone has the courage to touch the places you spent years guarding. They don't recoil at your anger. They don't try to fix your sadness. They don't minimize your needs or pathologize your intensity. They simply witness it, hold space for it, say, yes, this too, all of it. I can hold all of it. And in that moment, you discover the truth Jung spent his life pointing toward. We do not heal through love alone. We heal when we are loved in the language that awakens our soul. Because everyone has a different blueprint, different instructions for how to unlock them. Some hearts bloom at reassurance. They need to hear, I'm here, I'm staying, you're safe with me. Repeated like a mantra until the words sink past the armor into the wound. Some bloom at silence. They need someone who can sit in the quiet without trying to fill it, who understands that sometimes presence is the only medicine that works. Some open through softness, gentle touches, quiet affirmations, tenderness offered like water to parched ground. Some open through steadiness, unwavering commitment, reliability that proves itself through seasons, love that shows up even when it's inconvenient. Some require presence, undivided attention in a world of distractions, the gift of someone's full focus. Some require patience, time to unfold at their own pace without pressure or expectations. Some require a hand that feels like shelter, protection not from the world, but from the stories they tell themselves about being unworthy of protection. Few people bother to learn these things. They love in their default mode, expecting everyone to respond the same way. When their love doesn't land, they blame the recipient, call them cold, closed off, emotionally unavailable. They never consider that they might be speaking English to someone who only understands French. Fewer still remember them. Even when they learn your language, they forget. They revert to their own dialect under stress, or fatigue, or familiarity. They start speaking their language again, assuming you should have learned it by now, that you should have adapted to their way of loving, rather than requiring them to continually adapt to yours. The rarest love of all is the one that studies you like a universe, without rushing to conclusions, without assuming they already know how you work because they've loved others before, without fear that your complexity is a trap or a test or evidence of dysfunction. They approach you with curiosity rather than certainty. They ask questions rather than making assumptions. They pay attention to the patterns, what makes you withdraw, what makes you bloom, what language your body speaks when words fail. This kind of love does not ask you to shrink. It asks you to return. Return to the unedited version of yourself, the one that existed before you learned to perform normalcy. Return to the parts you hid because there was no room for them in previous relationships. Return to the voice you silenced because it confused the people you loved, made them uncomfortable, disrupted the narrative they needed to believe about who you were. When someone loves you fluently, you step back into your original shape, the shape you had before the world taught you to be smaller, before you learned that your fullness was threatening, before you discovered that being yourself required too much translation, too much explanation, too much energy that you no longer had. You become more patient with yourself, more honest. You stop editing your sentences before you speak them, stop running calculations about whether this feeling is acceptable or this need is reasonable. You let yourself want what you want without shame, feel what you feel without apologizing, need what you need without negotiating. You become more whole, not because you've integrated your shadow or done the therapeutic work or achieved some enlightened state, but because you no longer have to split yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You can bring all of yourself to the table, the light and the dark, the easy and the difficult, the parts that make sense and the parts that don't. You become more capable of breathing without flinching at your own reflection. Because when someone loves you in your language, they don't just accept you, they celebrate you. They find beauty in the things you were taught to hide. They're fascinated by the complexity you were told to simplify. They're drawn to the depth you were told to make shallow. The truth is simple. You were never impossible. You were speaking a language that no one else cared to learn. You were asking for a kind of love that required more than most people were willing to give. Not more love, but more attention, more curiosity, more willingness to step outside their comfort zone and learn something new. And then someone did. Someone arrived with gentleness that wasn't performative, not the kind offered to earn points or prove their goodness, but the kind that came from genuine care, with curiosity that wasn't intrusive, not prying or demanding, but open and inviting, with presence that didn't ask you to perform calmness or strength. You could be messy, uncertain, still figuring it out, with a listening that felt like home. The kind of listening where you could speak without measuring every word, where you could be silent without feeling like you were failing, where you could contradict yourself, change your mind, not have all the answers, and still be met with understanding rather than judgment. And suddenly, love wasn't something you chased. It wasn't a goal to achieve or a puzzle to solve or performance to perfect. It was something you recognized. A frequency you'd been waiting to hear your whole life. A matching. A soul turning toward another soul without fear of being misunderstood. To be loved in the language of your heart is the greatest miracle a romantic soul can receive. Not because it is dramatic, not because it looks like movie love, with grand gestures and passionate declarations, not because it is overwhelming, not because it consumes you or completes you or any of the other myths we've been sold about what love should be, but because it makes you feel real. After years of wondering if you were asking for something impossible, someone proves it exists. After years of feeling like a foreign country no one wanted to visit, someone learns the language and decides to stay. After years of believing your depth was a flaw, someone treats it like treasure. Seen. Not just looked at, but witnessed. Known. Understood in the way you've always needed to be understood. Not as a project to fix or a puzzle to solve or a challenge to overcome, but as a person. Complex, yes. Deep, yes. Worth the effort of learning, absolutely yes. Chosen in the way you actually needed to be chosen. Not chosen because you made yourself easy. Not chosen because you hid the difficult parts. Not chosen despite your complexity, but chosen because of it. Because someone looked at all of you, the light and shadow, the easy and difficult, the simple and complex, and thought, yes, all of this. I choose all of this. Held in the way your wounds understand. Because different wounds require different healing. Some need words. Some need silence. Some need time. Some need touch. And someone finally understands which medicine your particular wounds require. They don't offer you what worked on their wounds or what they think should work on yours. They offer you what you actually need. Met at the depth where your unlived life has been waiting. That part of you that never got to bloom because no one created the conditions for it. The dreams you never pursued because no one believed in them. The self you never became because no one made space for it. When someone speaks your language, they don't just love who you are, they midwife who you're becoming. And when that happens, you stop searching for miracles. You stop waiting for something extraordinary to save you, or complete you, or make everything make sense. You stop looking for signs in the universe, or scrolling for answers, or wondering when your real life will begin. You realize you are living inside one. The miracle isn't perfect. It doesn't solve every problem, or heal every wound, or make life easy. But it makes life real. It makes you real. It gives you permission to stop translating yourself and finally speak in your native tongue. The truth is, not everyone will learn your language. Many will try and fail. They'll download the app, practice a few phrases, get frustrated when fluency doesn't come easily. Many will love you in their own dialects and believe it is enough. They'll give you what they have and expect gratitude because they're giving their best, even if their best isn't what you need. Because only then could you recognize the rare miracle of being loved in the language your soul was born speaking. Only then could you stop performing and start being. Stop translating and start speaking. Stop shrinking and start expanding into the fullness of who you were always meant to become. This is the miracle. Not that someone appeared who could love you, but that someone appeared who could hear you, who listened past the words to the wound, who looked past the mask to the face beneath it, who stayed long enough to learn not just your language, but your accent, the unique way you speak it, shaped by everywhere you've been and everything that's broken you and all the ways you've learned to survive. And when you find that person, or when they find you, everything changes. Not externally. Your life might look the same from the outside, but internally, something shifts. A tightness you didn't know you were carrying releases. A question you've been asking your whole life finally receives an answer. A part of you that was holding its breath finally exhales. Because only then could you recognize the rare miracle of being loved in the language your soul was born speaking. Only then could you stop performing and start being. Stop translating and start speaking. Stop shrinking and start expanding into the fullness of who you were always meant to become. This is the miracle. Not that someone appeared who could love you, but that someone appeared who could hear you, who listened past the words to the wound, who looked past the mask to the face beneath it, who stayed long enough to learn not just your language, but your accent, the unique way you speak it, shaped by everywhere you've been and everything that's broken you and all the ways you've learned to survive. And when you find that person, or when they find you, everything changes. Not externally. Your life might look the same from the outside, but internally, something shifts. A tightness you didn't know you were carrying releases. A question you've been asking your whole life finally receives an answer. A part of you that was holding its breath finally exhales. You were never too much. You were just waiting for someone who could hold it all. And now someone can. Now someone does. Now someone speaks your language like they were born knowing it. Like they've been searching for someone who speaks it too. And in that recognition, in that resonance, in that rare and precious fluency, you finally come home.